Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. I was so busy reading my book, Warriors of the Word by Michael Newton. A really good friend of mine, Dane Sawyer, recommended this book to me, and I've really enjoyed it. Now, the same friend, Dane Sawyer, good friend of mine, he's been really studying the Independent Highland Companies, who have had such a profound impact not only on the military history of the United Kingdom, but also they've really had a lot of influence on the way we wear the kilt and all things associated with the kilt today. And to include, in some cases, clan tartans. So we'll get into this conversation with Dane in a minute. We're going to start in the origin of the Independent Highland Companies and move up through about the Battle of Culloden. There's a lot of cool things after the Battle of Culloden with this subject, but that'll have to wait for a part 2. And I know what you're thinking, Clint, where can I get one of those cool shirts with the clan on the front and the war cry on the back, or a battle shirt? Well, battle shirts can be available at the link in the description, where you can go over and pick from 4 different colors that you can have your clan's shirt and the war cry. If you click that link in the description, it'll take you over to a website where you can pick your clan's shirt. You can pick from 4 different colors. Now, if you don't see your clan on there, we do custom orders for sure. And we, in cases where a clan does not have a war cry associated with it, which many clans didn't, we'll use the heraldic motto in its place. What a cool way to display your heritage, to bring in a little bit of the values of that kindred that you want to embody and pass down to the next generation. And speaking of the next generation, what a cool idea for family reunions. Anyway, click that link. I'm going to turn you over to a quick word from my sponsor for this video, and then we're going to get on with the discussion with Dane. Thanks for joining me today.
Look, a lot of you are interested in the Scottish clans because of a genealogical connection to Scotland. You want to find out how you plug in to the Scottish clans. You want to know what is the rest of my story, and how does that contribute to who I am today. And I'm sorry to say I haven't been very helpful to a lot of you, but I'm really happy to say that I've partnered with MyHeritage, and MyHeritage has a lot to offer you to push back your family tree, to broaden this picture and help you to see the story of who you are and who your ancestors were. If you're just starting, you'd come up here to add family tree. This is what you do if you're starting from scratch. And it's super intuitive, it's super user-friendly. Enter in some basic information for your mother and your father. This is actually what I did do this to start off, even though I did something else later to import more names. But to start, I just did this and entered in my grandparents as well. And I found it very quick. The database is huge. It's like 33 billion files or access to names that you can drop into to try to find that. So if you're like me and you are the beneficiary of generations of people who've been working on your family tree and it is very well developed, then let me show you what else you can do that's really cool that MyHeritage is a feature with them. I took work that's already been done. It's already in Family Search. And I just imported, you can see this feature right here of sync. And I actually imported all of this work, this huge database, and I just pulled them over in one huge effort. And they landed here. And now I've got this squared away family tree. MyHeritage answers some drawbacks about the Family Search platform. One of them being that if you have a distant cousin who's working on the same line that you are, they can actually willy-nilly get in there and change it. And so the cool thing about MyHeritage is you can get in here and lock this up and decide who has access to this and who doesn't. All right, check this out. I uploaded this picture of my ancestor. This is my grandmother's grandfather. Look at this cool thing you can do with this. Isn't that cool? It totally brings him to life, but not as much as this does. Look at that. Isn't that? It's like my great-great-grandfather is sitting in front of me, who happens to look a lot like me. So that's a really cool feature. And then another thing, MyHeritage has a really developed DNA component to it. Really cool things they're doing with DNA. This is something you really want to look at. So if you're ready to take your family history work to the next level, go ahead and scan that QR code or follow that link that I have posted and watch the story of your people unfold before you. It's about identity. It's about finding out your story. This is not just going to bless your life, it's going to bless generations to come. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I got my friend Dane Sawyer with me today. Dane and I go way back. We were in the same unit in the 405th Civil Affairs. It's kind of a fringe element of the Army that it's not public affairs. They do something completely different. But he and I were in the same unit. We got to be good friends. We soon learned that we both had a passion for this history. So when we would go to drill, it was a reserve unit, and we'd go to drill and we would just nerd out the whole time, and we had to like.
When we had a couple extra minutes, we'd just shut the door and start talking about the clans.
Or somebody else would walk up, and we both had enough social acumen to just like change subjects real quick because we didn't want
code switch.
Otherwise, people would just show up, look at us for a couple seconds, and walk off. But so he's been way into this, and he is interested in certain parts of Scottish history that are super relevant to the Scottish clans, and you've gotten into like the later stuff, like 1800s, some of the Highland Companies' involvement in India or Crimea or some of those places. Do you want to just tell the audience anything else that you think they should know about you?
Yeah, so was in the Army with Clint. That was a great time. I remember a few times at the rifle range we used to blast pipe music. You remember that? Yeah, good times. But really got into the Highland clans because I studied tribal warfare, studied like transitionary states, studied like when ethnic groups kind of merged into other ethnic groups, and I think the Scottish Highlands is like a prime example of that, becoming Highlanders and Gaelic speaking peoples to becoming British, and just how that happened and how that worked. So really fascinates me, that transition. So the period from 1603 to like 1850, really fascinating, and just like how the Independent Highland Companies and how the regiments were part of like maintaining that Highland identity, but also at the same time working for the government and how that worked.
Isn't it kind of ironic that while a lot of symbols of Highland culture, which are now not just symbols of Highland culture, they're Scotland is in general icons, but when they're being suppressed, the place that they could flourish, you could still wear the kilt, you could still have the bagpipes.
Yeah,
was if you joined the army and were ready to go die for the
empire, for the
cause.
No, it's fascinating. I think a big moment for me, like anyone who researches tartan, it's like you realize, these weren't codified tartans until the military made them that way in the Victorian era. So that's kind of a moment for me where I was like, wait a second, like it's a big deal how these clans aligned with the government and essentially defined the clans and
sure
who
is.
They were.
Yeah, no, and I could tell when I was when we would just after we were both out of the army, but we still kept in touch, and we'd be on the phone, and I could tell that he had gone into this subject a little bit more. In fact, for me, I used to not like started getting into the 1600s, and I started to kind of lose interest because I thought it was starting to get watered down. But actually, you find some of when we're speaking of the Highlands, whereas in the borders, those guys were on their way out. Like as soon as King James VI becomes King James I of England, he really attacked that border country and was successful in kind of stamping that whole situation down there out. The Highlanders, you could argue, and I know a lot of people when they start to talk about the decline of the clans and the fall of the clans and all that, they're like, yeah, but it had started to erode much earlier, clear back into the 1600s. And I'm not even saying that that's not true, but you also have some really cool clan history from the 1600s. And we're going to talk about one aspect of that. So today's episode is going to be focused on the Independent Highland Companies. And he's read more than one source, but you want to show him what book you're pulling from?
So this is the best source I've found. It's the Independent Highland Companies, 1603 to 1760. And it's written by Peter Simpson, who was a Black Watch officer himself in the Army. So very well researched. You can tell he probably spent most of his post-military life researching, but great primary sources that he's got.
Probably a labor of love, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
But that's not the only... You've been talking about this long before you acquired that book. Yeah. So, but that's kind of where you're going to be pulling a lot of today's information. Sure. First question that I have for you is what were the conditions that led to the idea of independent Highland companies being where there are certain problems they're trying to solve that, hey, I know, let's do this.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So one fascinating thing about the Highland Companies is they're more or less organized by the Privy Council, and the Stuarts, as they had their power in the 17th century, they were run. They used a Privy Council. It wasn't parliamentary. It was a council of men, and they were the ones that would commission the Independent Highland Companies. So they were making decisions outside of the Highlands. And there were some boogeymen that lived in the Highlands that kind of necessitated the Independent Highland Companies. Probably the main one would be Clan Gregor, the MacGregors.
Which you have connections to.
I do, yes. I do have
under the name change.
Yeah, Gregory, a Gregory grandmother. So it kind of hurts my heart when I'm doing research and you have this 150, 200 year span of time where the crowns just trying to, both crowns, Stuarts and Hanoverians, are just trying to stamp out the MacGregor name. But so I think you had the conditions where the crown's not able to project power very well out into the Highlands and Islands. You have a transition where England and Britain, with the Union of the Crowns, it's a rising power. They've had some victories over Spain, the Spanish Armada, and rising naval power, so they're able to project a little better. And so they see, obviously, the Highlands and Islands as right in the heart of what they're trying to build, something they need to pacify. And so I think the big impetus to this, and we can talk about it, is the Battle of Glenfruin. 1603 is when the government gets together, the Privy Council says, we're going to make independent Highland companies. The Duke of Athol commissioned some Stuarts, 2 Stuart captains, and their commission essentially was to go in to right around the MacGregor lands and stamp out the MacGregors and all the lawlessness in that area.
So for those of you who don't know, the Battle of Glenfruin is a really, really interesting battle. And it's funny because the MacGregor histories that if you do a quick Google search, and this is something I talked about with Dr. MacGregor, is that it's like, oh, they were descended from Kenneth MacAlpin, and then they were outlawed.
Yeah.
They skipped this gigantic period of history.
Yeah.
But that part that they land on right there is the Battle of Glenfruin, which prompted them to be outlawed. And I've read, just to give people just a super brief idea of what we're talking about, if they're not familiar with the Battle of Glenfruin, is that there had been a company of Cahoons. Now, I've read different origins of this. One source will tell you that they were under a government commission to go up and fire and sword against the MacGregors. Yeah. And another one is they were supposed to, the chiefs, it was like a mutually agreed meeting between the chiefs to work some stuff out because there had been beef and some trouble earlier involving McFarlands. The McFarlands and MacGregors, it's natural that we're sitting here together because the McFarlands and MacGregors were pretty good friends. Yeah. And that's what I have my tie to the Highlands is which is funny because you guys took the brunt, and Dr. MacGregor and I had a pretty good laugh over that because your guys' face was all over it, and like McFarlands are like, oh,
we had the outlaw brand for
sure.
Yeah.
So but one way or the other, regardless of why the Cahoons are moving toward the MacGregors with force, the MacGregors got the jump on them.
They did.
Ambushed them. Killed a lot of them. There's tactics and stuff we could go into about how they did it, but I think maybe we'll just keep it simple. And now, if that was a government commission, then King James takes that personally.
Exactly. Yeah, and from what I've read, it was a government commission. It was a government-sanctioned movement by they had gone to the government, the king, and he had personally commissioned them to have some retribution. The sources are a little hazy, and it doesn't help that Sir Walter Scott got involved. But there were some MacGregors that had been kidnapped and killed. there were some McGregors. I think Sir Walter Scott said they were just these humble McGregors that happened to be in the wrong place, killed the sheep to survive, and the Calhouns,
that's right,
executed them. So, the McGregors, though, they were known for their pride. They were known for the Gregorach and their ability to project power quickly, call them into arms, and they had that name. They were like the guerrilla warfare fighters of the area. So, and they showed the Calhouns that day, and so the independent companies, I think, were, like you said, the king took that personally, and he went to the Duke of Athol, and they had that commission to go into that area, and it wasn't just the McGregors; it was what the sources call broken men, and I think an interesting dynamic was happening, like with the rise of power, with the union of the crowns. I think the Stuarts saw an opportunity to use the resources that they had from the lowlands of Scotland and from England, and to impose feudalism on the Highlands. And Peter Simpson, in his book, he says that the imposition of feudalism is what caused a lot of the problems in that area, where you had some clans that had titled lands, some chieftains that had no titles.
That had held it by the sword.
Had held it by occupation and by the sword. And, the idea that, like for the McGregors, for example, could live in the lands that they'd been in for so long.
Yeah, they moved into the Rannoch Moor and occupied there by force. Yeah,
by force, but they also had like the ancestral lands.
Like Glenstray.
Glenstray especially. Yeah. And but then you had the Duke of Argyll and some of his chiefs and minor dukes. They had title to McGregor land. And that, that caused a problem. And I think it'd be really fascinating to kind of compare and contrast who held what titles and where violence exploded. Because I think...
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think a lot of it was the feudalism trying to be imposed by the crown. These clans, like McGregor's prime example, didn't have title. And the Statutes of Iona, I think it was the crown saying, hey, let's get things organized. Come sign this thing. Present your titles. Let's get everything organized. Let's educate your sons in the lowlands. Let's actually become one kingdom. And I think the clans obviously had a problem with that.
Right, and you can, you kind of see it from both angles. Like, if I were a king, I wouldn't just running amok. Right. Especially when you're looking at other, like your southerly neighbors, which by this time, by 1609, where the Statutes of Iona were signed, by that time, King James VI is King James I of England. Yeah. But you look down at England, and it seems to be a much more orderly, like the kind of order that they were trying to do it. And on the other hand, with the Highlanders, they're like, no, that's not how we do it. Now, when we say feudalism is such a broad topic. We're not talking about the system of vassalage and service to, okay, you got a knight, and he goes to the king, but then he has guys underneath him that owe him military, that structure. Because the Highlanders had adopted that willingly centuries before. The part of this that you're talking about specifically is that when the Normans come in, it was very organized, very record-keeping, just a system that did integrate, but you had some people who were like, no, we've just held this forever. And that's the part that you're more referring to, rather than a legal charter. Some clans had them, you're right, some clans occupied by force.
Yeah, and so the titles become a big argument.
Even that could cause like even inter-clan stuff, like because the Lords of the Isles, some of the clans held their lands by charter from him, but what happens when the king strips the lordship of the Isles from the MacDonalds of Islay?
Right. Oh, we got... That was awesome.
What just happened?
That was a great point. So you got some fireworks on there.
And well, so when they get their charters, when the lordship of the Isles gets stripped, who do you hold your charter from?
Right. It's from...
And the kings are like, no, we're the guys.
Right.
Trying to enforce that.
And you see, with the inability to kind of have, sheriffs in a lot of these Highland areas, just the inability to have any type of legal jurisdiction, the crown really starts using the land titles as a lot of their power. And, you know, the 180 years that we're going to talk about, so many sides are switched, right? We're talking about a really tumultuous part of history where you have the Civil War, you have the Bishops' War, you have the Three Kingdoms, you have the Jacobite
first
uprising.
Jacobite rebellions,
Yeah,
late 1600s.
Yeah, so you're talking about a lot of, and you know, these clans, you know, I like to think of them as give me the best deal you got. So
ultimately, like when we're talking about different systems, they just went with the best deal. Like selecting a chief, primogeniture, where this was the firstborn son, or tanistry, where they're this chosen ahead of time, and it could be from this larger group of people. In my study of this, like people want to codify it and make it like they were using this system or that. Really, they just did whatever they thought was best. The leading members of the clans got together, and they'd be like, there's no way we're going with the oldest son. The guy's a nincompoop.
You're right.
We're going with this other guy. And so they got to say, well, the oldest kid was born out of wedlock. So he was... No, he wasn't. You just didn't want him.
Yeah. All of a sudden, he's legitimate because he's actually... So that's kind of the start of it. And then also you have cattle being just central to the system. You have agriculture as well, but that's mostly like cereal to feed sheep, to feed people. Cattle, they're grown and sold. You're trying to sell them before the winter, or else you have to feed them through the winter. Yeah. So there's a lot of movement. And then you have this whole group of men, taxmen, that are moving cattle. They're planting in the spring. They're fighting, moving cattle in the summer, and then going back to harvest in the fall. So cattle become a huge central part of conflict. It's land and cattle.
Gotcha.
And you have just the lawlessness of McGregors and the other kin groups in that area that are known for their trickery with cattle. And it's not just stealing cattle; it's protecting cattle too.
Right. And there's a racket, and
the
McGregors were. There were several Highland clans that were known when this was kind of a thing in the Highlands, but not every clan did it equally.
Right. Some did it better.
Some
did it
were
better
more
than the others.
There was, I think, another Walter Scott romanticism was in the Lennox area. Yeah. The full moon became known as McFarland's Lantern.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we got conditions set, and they're like, okay, we got to solve a problem. Let's, tell me if I'm accurate on this, let's raise native Gaels, native Highlanders who know the area, know the culture. Let's see if that gets us farther than whatever we've been using previous. Is that am I on the right
you're
track?
Right. You know, in the first two iterations, like 1603 and then 1624, they were mounted, which made them a little different.
Were the whole company mounted, or was it just the officers?
The whole company's mounted.
Really?
So these aren't coming from. You're not recruiting from the dregs of society. You're getting paid. You're coming from families that had the means to mount these soldiers. And they are Gaels, and they go in, and essentially not a lot of bloodshed. They negotiate, and as people that worked in civil affairs, that's what we did. You know, we talked with the locals. I wish that we would have been better at the language, but yeah, just go in, negotiate.
What are you talking about? You did all sorts of missions to the Philippines, and you speak fluent Tagalog.
That is true, which is another thing that fascinates me about these companies is they know the people they're working with, and there are multiple stories. There's a great story of a McGregor who gets surrounded by government troops, and I think this is later, and this is like right before the Rob Roy time. It's not Rob Roy, but he gets surrounded by a company, and the company captain goes in and he says, "You're surrounded. There's a price on your head." And the guy's like, let's just have some breakfast first, please. And they start drinking whiskey. And by the end of the day, the McGregor agrees to return cattle, but he's not captured. And this is how they operate, you know, because they're Gaels, and they're like, okay.
But the problem was fixed, though.
The problem was fixed, yeah. But yeah, you kind of see that the independent companies are this buffer between the government, who wants to, even after Culloden and some of the Rising of the 15, you have these independent Highland companies that are kind of a buffer, and like, you know what, let's go in, we'll talk to them, we'll bring who needs to be brought to justice. Whereas the government troops really wanted blood. And so that was a really cool aspect of the companies.
As they could bridge that cultural gap.
And they did
That's
the mopping
really cool.
up operations and spared a lot of people because they were sympathetic, you know.
Yeah. These are
our people. We know, we kind of know why.
Like, I got it. We still cattle sometimes.
Yeah.
But you got to go put them back.
Right. But that becomes more important in the larger, like, pitched battles. Later on.
Great.
So you have your first two iterations, 1603. This lasted for a couple of years. They were actually able to, kind of pacify the region. The Stuarts, one thing that plagued them in the 17th century was just money. They just didn't have the funds to keep these independent companies out there in the field.
Okay.
So these lasted a few years. 1624, an era of famous reavers, like Walter Scott talks about them again in that era. But one thing that really kind of condemns the independent Highland companies is just all of the things that start happening in the 1640s and 50s.
Oh, yeah. That was a busy time for fighting troops.
Yeah, so you couldn't have, there were Scottish troops fighting in the continent. And then back in Scotland, you had Marquis of Montrose just, with his Irish troops, just really running wild.
He got Alistair McCulloch to bring up all of his bros.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, the MacDonalds were a big clan. And at one time, they were all united under the Lordship of the Isles. The Lord of the Isles was the chief of all the MacDonalds, but then they lost that lordship, and these different MacDonald branches, there was some cohesion. It's not like they just completely scattered and did their own things, but each branch takes a life of its own, more so than like Campbell branches that had that strong central leadership throughout. And one of these MacDonald branches was in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And even the ones in Northern Ireland and the ones in the Southern Hebrides, there's a lot of back and forth. And Alistair McCulloch MacDonald comes from, originally you can trace his lineage, which I just did recently, back into the same family that become the Earls of Antrim. So he's very closely connected with Northern Ireland, and he's the one that Montrose, James Graham, gets to come fight with them. And good thing he did, because he brought a lot of fighting power to the game there.
And changed some tactics.
He did introduce some really potent techniques, some TTPs and
just on paper a lot more successful than you would think he would be. Just a string of victories.
He was a force. He's like a force of nature.
Yeah.
He was.
But he, like many other people, switched sides a few times, and he got the.
Well, even Montrose started off with the Covenanters.
Right.
Started there, and then he's like an indicative of the bigger picture.
Yeah, and just speaking of the bigger picture, I think this is, not surprisingly, but the Campbells were Covenanters at first, and kind of were staunch Covenanters, switched sides, but this is when kind of their power, we talk about the Campbells, a lot of the MacGregor grievances, when the Campbells kind of turned their back on the MacGregors as patrons, and in open conflict with the MacGregors. 10 MacGregor chiefs and minor chiefs were executed in 1603-04 after Glenfruin. But anyway, we're digressing. But
well, I think that's as we move into these different conflicts that explode on a national scale, these previous grudges come with. And there's some people who don't give a darn about what's happening at the upper echelons of society in this dynasty versus this dynasty. For some of them, it's as simple as, those rascals joined that side. Yeah. Okay, I'm on the other side, and we're just going to go have at it. You can see that happen in our Revolutionary War, into the Civil War. Yeah. You go to the Kansas-Missouri border wars that were going on right before the Civil War erupts. I mean, you can see it. Right. This is a theme throughout history, not just Scotland. Right. But for sure in the world of clans.
Right. Yeah, so it's fascinating. But in this time period, after kind of the Civil Wars died down, Cromwell and some of his lieutenants actually do a really good job of pacifying the Highlands. And not pacifying, but making deals with some of the chieftains. But one thing that does emerge, you get the MacDonalds of Glencoe, of Keppoch, the Camerons, and the McGregors were probably lurking in there too. But they kind of formed this bond of saying, we're kind of on our own here. And that's a theme that kind of the Independent Highland Companies have to confront for the rest of their history, is kind of that alliance there.
So, go ahead, Reed. Did you have something you want to tag on there? Because I've got a question.
Yeah, sure.
We did a little prep and I got some questions down that I want to make sure we cover here. So the Independent Highland Companies work for the crown, and that's a different dynasty in the early 1600s than it is in the late 1600s than it is even into the early 1700s, because you go from the Stuarts to the William of Orange takes over for a while, but then we also see the Hanoverians come in shortly thereafter.
Right.
But that's whoever's running the top level. The Independent Highland Companies work for them ultimately. Is there anything in between that we have to know to understand it?
I think, yeah, so it more or less works for the crown. As the Campbells got more power and wealth, you kind of see, and we'll talk about it in one of the later iterations, but after the Stuart Restoration of 1660, you see the Campbells kind of taking charge of the Highland Companies and starting to use them for their own purposes, which is super fascinating.
Really? I would have never guessed that.
Yeah.
I would have never guessed.
Super fascinating to talk about, but that's a really good question. So a lot of it's, it gets to a boiling point. They send in the Highland Companies who kind of talk to the chieftains, negotiate with them, get the reaving down. But there's an interim period between 1624 and 1667 where you have private watches. They're not from the crown. They're chieftains. They set up their own unpaid private watch from their taxmen. They guard the passes, the glens, and
guarding them from what?
From the cattle thieves.
Oh, so this is just... Now, when we say cattle thieves, are we going back to this group of clans that had kind of colluded here with the Camerons, MacDonalds of Keppoch?
Yeah.
Probably McGregors.
McGregors, definitely. McFarlane's.
Rascals.
The Rascals, yeah. So I think it's funny. I keep talking about the McGregors, but when you look at the primary sources, the Crown is really obsessed with the McGregors. They list them specifically.
They're like the poster child for all that is wrong with the Highlands.
They list them specifically, but so they have these private watches that aren't paid. So I wouldn't call them Independent Highland Companies. Okay. They're not organized. They're not commissioned.
Gotcha.
But then something changes. 1667, the government gets very serious. They start raising 2 more Highland Companies. You have the Duke of Argyll, who really wants to get involved. I think he sees how much money the Crown's willing to put into this. And so within a few years, a Campbell gets appointed as captain of one of the companies.
Okay. It's not Argyle, is it? Because in my head, I think that he would be above. Is it Argyle?
No, it's not. In fact, he's kind of an interesting guy. His name is James Campbell of Lowers, Lawers.
I think that was a cadet branch of the Campbells of Glenorchy.
Okay.
I think.
Those scoundrels.
We'll put the correction on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, so he wasn't particularly liked by his own chieftain, actually. But he was fairly effective in what he did. And there's some really good government documentation of how much they were paid. They're actually given firelocks. You can see the loadout of the weapons.
They get the upgraded weapons.
Yeah, upgraded weapons, 100 firelocks. You get to see their pay, which I've tried to do calculations of what that's worth today, but it's really murky with like Scottish sterling.
Gotcha.
Converted. I've tried many times. So if someone can do the conversion, that would be great.
Yeah, reach out or put it in the comments.
But then, it spreads to 4 companies. The Campbells are running. The MacDonalds of Glengarry is another captain, which it had been the Duke of Athol. So that was interesting to me that that it would switch that way. But Argyle, to tell a story, the Duke of Argyle was beefing with the MacLeans on Mull.
Yeah.
At the time, so he sent a company over to Mull, and he started getting in light skirmishes to kind of bring the MacLeans to heel, and he did with an Independent Highland Company.
Okay.
And then they go to Tobermory, and he uses them to search for one of the sunken Spanish Armada ships.
Really?
Yeah, he uses them. So apparently there's this ship that after the Armada was destroyed, it went... Have you heard this story?
No. I knew that there was some Spanish Armada stuff in Ireland and on the west coast of Scotland, but this is new.
Yeah, so and it's documented. I'm pretty sure it actually happened.
You're not just making this up out of thin air.
So it goes to Tobermory Bay, and while there's a resupply, something happens. The ship explodes. It catches fire. People don't know if it was some Scots that snuck on and blew it up. Nobody knows, but it was apparently very rich and wealthy, and people are actually still looking for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a pretty famous thing for people to search for. But he used the Independent Highland Company. They were there for months searching for this treasure, which I think, if you're the Crown and you find out the Duke of Argyle's using privately,
yeah.
So
did they find out the Crown?
They didn't. I'm sure they
was using them like that.
I'm sure they did, because they were disbanded shortly after. So there were things going on. They were accused of having ghost rosters, so saying that they had
got this many men, so we need this much pay.
40 men when you have 15 men actually showing up for the fight, showing up for work. Just accused of that, and again, it was like just the inability of the stewards to really have their guys out there. They didn't have eyes and ears, so these were disbanded. One thing we haven't talked about is the Commission of Fire and Sword.
Okay, let's do it. So catching us up to this point, you've got some problems in the Highlands. Mm-hmm. The Crown thinks that the best way to, or somebody, maybe it wasn't his idea originally, but somebody convinces him the best way to handle this problem is to use native troops to police, and that was the main mission. That they were policing forces, correct? Correct. And so we have these groups forming at different time which clans they were and who was forming them. You have something that looks like an Independent Highland Company, wasn't technically, but now you have them. The Duke of Argyle is using them, right? And you have a thing that is employed called the Commission of Fire and Sword, which is what, and what is it used for? Yeah, so the Commission of Fire and Sword is like last resort effort. This started in the 16th century. I was going to say it goes back farther than... Yeah, it goes back. I think it's like 1528. James V, the first Commission of Fire and Sword against Clandanas. So essentially that's the Crown saying, you've gone too far. This kin group, this clan, and I am commissioning people to come into your lands, kill all of you. Just leave the women, leave the clergy, kill all of you. Take whatever they can, and that's their pay. Set everything else on fire. Yeah. There was no judiciary in place. There was no, it's... And it was often used to play one clan off of the other. Yeah, one clan had a grievance. They would go... These guys are getting a little uppity. We're going to give these guys Commission of Fire and Sword. Yeah. Yeah, so the first time an independent company marches along with the Commission of Fire and Sword, that's Captain Kenneth Mackenzie, assisted the Fire and Sword against the MacDonalds, and that leads to the Battle of Mulroy. One of the funnest battles to study. Yeah, and wow. Yeah, when I study that battle, it's like I did not see the outcome coming. Because you have professional Independent Highland Companies, Commission of Fire and Sword, you have government troops, you have cavalry against MacDonalds. Of Keppoch, specifically, right? Yeah. And do you have more background into what started that battle? I did a podcast episode on it a little while ago, but it was interesting because you have, with this specific battle, a lot of people, there's a debate whether it's the last clan battle or not. And I think what you're teaching us about in Independent Highland Companies plays right into whether it was or not. But you had the Statutes of Iona in 1609 was an effort to integrate, and you could probably get a more scholarly answer on this, but an effort to integrate these guys who are kind of been functioning in their heads in their own kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
But no, you're not your own kingdom. You're part of this, and we want you to send your sons to lowland universities so they can integrate. We want you to stop doing these things that we think are significant indicators or even causes of you guys doing your own thing and becoming dangerous in the process.
Sign on to the feudal system that we're running.
And so as a result of that, you have and this is a fascinating backstory in and of itself. The chief of the MacDonalds of Keppoch is murdered while his son's off in I think it was the University of St. Andrews. I think. And because he's there because of the Statutes of Iona. And they're trying to make a good little lowlander out of him. Which is funny because this young man's name's Cole of the Cows.
Cole of the Cows, yeah.
Probably not because he was really good, had like a really good breeding program. Probably because he was good at acquiring more cattle than he started off with at the first of the day.
Yeah.
So he comes back from being a good little, trying to be made a good little lowlander, becomes one of the most iconic Highland chiefs ever.
Yeah.
Picks up his dad's business, actually reaches out to Lachlan McIntosh, says, hey, can we work something out? Lachlan, an older by this time chief of the McIntoshes and captain of Clanhattan, basically gives him the middle finger and comes down in there with this commission of fire and sword with his own troops from Clanhattan, not to include the McPhersons who gave him the middle finger and said, no, you're not our boss. We think we should be the captains of Clanhattan.
And there were a number of clans that didn't go along with this commission of fire and sword.
Right.
Yeah, that saw it as like a conflict between two families. Didn't really get involved.
So Lachlan McIntosh comes down not only with a bunch of his own men from Clanhattan, but also with an independent Highland Company. Now, this is where some people want to say, no, it's not a clan battle because you're using government troops.
Yeah.
But that depends on who these troops are, doesn't it?
Right.
Okay, so who?
Yeah.
You said it earlier,
these
but
are Mackenzies. Yeah.
They're the captains of Mackenzie.
Yeah, and just to clarify, these independent Highland companies, through the history, there's only one Highland company that you can argue through this almost 200 years that we're talking about that wasn't raised by a clan chief. So these are raised by clan chiefs. The one company is, I think it was in 1742 that was raised by the city of Inverness.
Okay.
Yeah, but other than that, it's the commission from the Privy Council or from later on from the government.
So the nature of the clanship is baked into this concept.
It's baked in. They go to the clan chief and they say, raise your men. Here, you have a commission. You have a captain. Pick your captain from your clan.
Right.
Yeah.
So whether it was a chief himself or an echelon down, like what in Gaelic would be the Dine Wussel.
Yeah, would be the captain.
And so in this case, it was a subordinate Mackenzie who's raising. It'd be interesting to see the muster roll of his men. Not that surnames are a dead giveaway to what clan you're in, but I will bet you, I'd be willing to bet that there would be at least a healthy dose of Mackenzies in there.
Maybe we can, because I do have a list of all the surnames. I have a list of the rosters, so maybe we can put that in your notes.
Yeah.
So people would be interested in
that. So check down in the description for a little bit more information on that.
Yeah, so that's interesting. But yeah, most of them would be Mackenzies in that company.
Interesting.
So Battle of Mulroy, Highland charge at its finest.
On the part of the MacDonalds and their allies.
Yeah.
They allied with a couple other branches of MacDonalds and probably Camerons.
Yes.
Who they were good friends with, close by.
Right.
Geographically.
It's super one-sided victory for the Highlanders. But they were all Highlanders. But super one-sided victory for the MacDonalds. And we joke, one of our favorite people to talk about is Donald Dane. And that was his first engagement. And he was a great swordsman, professional soldier.
Went on to be like the best.
Went on to be the best. but in that battle, ran all the way back to Inverness.
He wasn't broke in yet. He was still a little, he was still a little green, a little wet behind the ears. But like if you have not learned about Donald Bain, and sometimes he's written as Donald MacBain, which is interesting because that's a Clanhattan. The McBains were, or McBains, they were a Clanhattan group, but they were. He's a fascinating. There needs to be somebody. I know that there's all sorts of big names in Hollywood to watch this YouTube channel and listen to this podcast. I'm just throwing it out there. You can make a lot of money by doing some work on Donald Bain or Donald McBain. But this is his first engagement. Yeah. And he gets chased off the battlefield and just starts running and doesn't stop till he gets to Inverness.
And it's interesting because he wrote his own account, which is why we're still talking about it.
Right. But becomes like a renowned swordsman later in life. Yeah. Like even in old age. Yeah. He's incredible. Yeah.
But a lot of lessons I'm sure he learned that day at Mulroy. But yeah, so it's interesting. They as it progresses, as you know, the political upheaval, especially this period of time, is defined by the Jacobite uprisings.
As we get into like the
as we get into
1600s,
1689, 1690. 1715, 1719,
which
and 45
goes unnoticed because it was kind of just like a hiccup.
Yeah, which 1719 we can talk about it later. But did you know Rob Roy was like highly involved?
I didn't know he's highly involved.
Guided the Spanish troops that actually landed.
Really?
And I'm sure he was like, man, if I can pull this off, what the things I'm going to do to these Campbells, the things I'm going to do to these Campbells.
He wasn't the first person to think about what can I do to the Campbells.
Yeah, that's true.
Like 1640s, you had a bunch of MacDonalds thinking that, Laments as well. Yeah. That, and you can argue that leads into the Dunoon massacre.
Wow. Yeah.
Anyway, it's a little bit side story.
Yeah,
but
side stories.
What can I do to McDonald's has been maybe a theme.
Yeah. So we have...
or the Campbells. Did I say what can I do?
Oh, yeah, you said...
What can I do to the Campbells?
Campbells. Yeah. Which, you know, I think a lot of us still think that to this day. But...
I don't know. I'm not a hater.
Okay.
I got time for that.
You have too many Campbell
I have a lot
people
of,
listening.
Some good. I have a lot of good friends that are Campbells. Like some good ones, yeah. You know what? Funny thing is, this is a little side note. When I lived back in Grace, Idaho, I had loved both of these families, Campbells and McGregors.
Oh man!
And when you consider that Grace has a population of about 1,000 people, not including the surrounding areas, to have both Campbells and McGregors, man, that's a treat. Yeah, but they're fine families, both of them. And I right now regularly interact with Campbells.
That's I've mentioned great. You keep the peace between them.
I'm okay with that, yeah.
Yeah, and here's another side note. I don't know if you know this about Clint, but he lives in like the most beautiful part of the country. It honestly reminds me of Glens surrounded by mountains. Like we're looking out at some mountains right now.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And it like honestly, like driving through Scotland, it's the mountains.
Right now, it's all green because it's in the spring.
That's true.
Wait till mid-July. There's a lot more brown out there.
Yeah. And you're a cattleman too.
I do come from cattle families on both my mom and my dad's side of the family.
So you understand, like these Highland soldiers, a lot of them are cattlemen, and these are some of the toughest, roughest
people. I would like to say that there's a correlation there between cattlemen and...
Oh, yeah. It would be interesting because, you know, Spain had the tradition of cattle and some of the best soldiers that have ever walked the earth.
Yeah,
so
that's cool.
And you've fought down cattle before.
You faced them down. Really... We could tell some stories.
Yeah, you'll need to tell some stories. maybe to your OnlyFans subscribers. So continuing on, you have the independent company head dies at Mulroy. That's how fierce the fighting was. So then you have a Captain Robert Menzies who gets a commission. The government's still thinking this is a great idea to have these independent companies, and then we have Viscount Dundee, who's raising his own Jacobite rebellion, and the independent company actually knows that there's a government push, and we get the Battle of Killiecrankie, which is another fascinating battle.
By this point, we have in the formative days it was one thing, but by now we have specific clans that are a lot more involved in this idea than others.
Correct, yeah.
And it's a fairly small handful of them, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's Campbell's, it's Mackenzie's. The Earls of Athol were in the beginning, but through the political turmoil, they kind of don't take the lead anymore. You have Fraser's of Lovett that become more involved probably in 20 or 30 years, 1720s. Yeah, but most...
Grant,
yeah.
Frookie.
Yeah.
Not of Glenmoriston. Glenmoriston was a cadet branch,
Yeah.
but they tended...
Yeah, so
do their own
you
thing.
have this anti-Jacobite bloc. It's the Monroes, it's the Grants, it's the Campbells, it's the Sutherlands, it's the Rosses down south. You have Brody's, the Roses, and they kind of form this, and did I say Grant Forbes? They kind of form this block, and most from there, that's where most of the Independent Highland Company captains are being drawn from.
Interesting.
It's very rare to see other names on those rosters. So you have the Battle of Killiecrankie. The Highland Company they're on the losing side again, but they fight very well. Hugh Mackay, who's a professional,
He fought on the continent, didn't he?
He was a veteran. He fought in the Dutch army. He was a professional soldier.
Yeah.
He was given control of the government troops, Gaelic speaker. So we're not talking lowlander. We're not talking very professional. After the battle, when the government troops were defeated, he had only good things to say about the Independent Company. Apparently, they were some of the only people that stood and fought.
Really?
Yeah, and covered the retreat. So they fought bravely. Yeah, like I said, a lot of quotes from Hugh Mackay. He liked him so much. He personally went to the government and he said, "Let's give them a commission. Let's bump their pay. Let's give them a garrison." So this is when you start getting Fort William.
Okay.
In
Now,
Vermilion region.
if he was such a renowned person, then his word would carry a little weight when
Definitely.
he made recommendations.
Yeah. And he ends up winning the day, right? So Viscount Dundee, unfortunately, wins the battle but dies that day.
Okay.
Hugh Mackay loses the battle, lives to fight another day. Jacobite rebellion doesn't...
The Mackays don't get as much of attention because they're like so far off in the north, out on the fringe.
Yeah.
But they were a force. If you read the genealogical history of the Earldom of Sutherland, which is written by a guy who's closely related to the Earls of Sutherland, in the 1600s, so in this time period.
Yeah.
And Mackays were something else.
Yeah, and there was a lot of... What we don't talk about is like the recruitment of Mackays and famously the Mackays that go and fight on the continent.
Yes.
And
they
so
get some good reps down there, don't they?
Oh, they get some great... and it's still... You get these quotes from the Europeans that were fighting and they get... Oh, man, they're in it. And they become generals. And they go... Sweden, they get commissions.
Yeah.
But the Mackay, there were a few family names that they were recruited from, and Mackay's up there. It's not
Probably
really
still
my
some Mackays
expertise,
running
but
around in
but
Sweden
I think
right now to this day.
no, there is. There's. I have. It'd be fascinating, but I've seen videos of Swedes that have Gaelic last names.
Really?
And they trace it back to the mercenaries that would have fought there. I'd love to have a paper or a link, and we can post that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Because I have family in Sweden, so
Yeah, I'm talking all the time about Scotland, but I actually have Swedes on both sides of the family in my family tree.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. But I think you'd have a lot more soldiers in these willing to join these Highland companies, but they're being pushed out to fight another conflict.
Okay.
So you have this Robert Menzies, this great guy. He goes, sets up garrison at Fort William. Well liked among all of the chieftains. Kind of uses his negotiating skills. Really pacifies a lot of the robbing that's going on. But unfortunately dies at the age of 32 a couple of years later. Oh. And I think it's fascinating because it's been, and this is what Peter Simpson in his book said, among other people, if he would have been around, the massacre at Glencoe probably wouldn't have happened.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they say he had such a good relationship with all the clans that there was sort of a vacuum of power when he died.
Interesting.
And his companies were disbanded again. And then, so you have the Earl of Breadalbane, Campbell, who kind of takes power. And so they get rid of this idea of Independent Highland Companies. Okay. And they say, we'll give you £2,000 sterling, I think was the number. and you make it happen. These aren't going to be independent Highland companies. He takes over.
The independent part of it goes away.
And so now it's you know, the Campbells that are kind of in control, and it's a testament to they've chosen the right side a couple times now, and they're
have a
a
knack.
force.
They don't have an unbroken record, but they had a pretty good record,
and they're a force in the region.
Sure. Well, so I just a little question there when we talk about the independent Highland companies. Mm-hmm. I think we've established the Highland part of it. These are clans drawn from, companies, government troops drawn from the clans with often one of their own as a leader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The independent part of it, what is that? That's maybe a little bit of a curveball question.
Yeah, that is. I think independent in the sense that they're not sticking around.
It's temporary
territory. Yeah.
Oh, and they're pushed off.
They're independently able to roam into independent of.
There's a little more autonomy.
Okay. They're not regulars. I think that's the distinction because with the especially the Hanoverian troops becoming more professional.
Gotcha.
You have some of these battles we're talking about. You have regulars that are forming up and fighting these battles. The independent companies aren't part of. They're not on the line. They're not troops of the line. They're not foot regiments.
Okay.
So they have a special commission. They're not being expected to fight with regulars. That's not what they do, even though it happened, as we've talked about in a couple of conflicts. But this comes to a head, actually, with the Black Watch in 1744-45.
That's where I was going next, because I know you've got a hard time. You've got something on the other end of this, and I don't want to make you late for that thing, because it's kind of a big thing. But I do before you skedaddle, I would like to know, because you're starting to lean automatically, naturally into this Jacobite rebellion as we get into. So how did the independent Highland companies? What bearing did that have on Jacobite rebellions? Did their effect go clear up into the 45?
Yeah. So without getting into the specific names and everything, just to tell a broader story, a lot of scholars, including Peter Simpson, they agree that the independent Highland companies were more of a shaping operation instead of.
Now, for non-military officers and other experienced NCOs and stuff, a shaping operation would be what?
So instead of fighting in the battles themselves, like Battle of Culloden had one company of new Black Watch soldiers, ineffectual.
Okay.
A lot of the independent Highland companies were held in reserve at that battle, so they weren't major players. But what they did do is, since they were pushed up into the Highlands, they were negotiating with clans that were on the fence. And they were saying, you might not want to, because we're actually guarding this pass, or we're guarding these roads. So you might want to rethink your 100 or 200 guys that you're about to send over.
Which would affect the overall number of troops.
Oh yeah, greatly.
If Bonnie Prince Charlie could have just overwhelmed Cumberland with sheer numbers, they had an effect. So shaping operations are helping set conditions for an effective main effort.
Right, and for example, there were some Highland companies operating around Inverness in the 45, and they drew a lot of Jacobite troops. They were holding Inverness, and it took some troops to go up there to kick them out. There wasn't a fight there, but they were still holding it.
But
they needed
they
to push
weren't
them out.
on Culloden,
and they didn't fight at Culloden.
Right.
They didn't fight at Culloden, and they were
interesting.
Like the McGregors were up there doing that, and they were not at Culloden. So there's an estimate. Peter Simpson in his book, he says it could have been 10 to 20,000 more troops on the Jacobite side.
Wow!
If it wasn't for the Highland companies.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's his estimate. That would have made a difference.
Yeah,
for sure.
The MacDonalds specifically are named as not joining.
Certain branches of them.
Certain branches for not joining. And there's a great quote from a MacDonald chieftain, and he's talking to the Duke of Cumberland, I think. And he said, well, wouldn't have made much of a difference. And he said, if my clan were rebels, you wouldn't have crossed into Scotland in the first place. Yeah, and I can find.
Do you know which one that is?
I can find
the quote. That's
one
of the MacDonald chiefs?
Yeah, I can find the quote. Yeah.
Okay, so Dane found the quote, and it was Alexander MacDonald of Slate.
Of Slate, yeah. And I'll just read from here, and he's talking to the Duke of Cumberland. On another occasion of greetings revealed the arrogance of Cumberland and the proud spirit of Sir Alexander. So here comes the great rebel of the Isles, taunted Cumberland. Sir Alexander proudly replied, if, sir, I had been a rebel, you would have never crossed the Spey. So, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever side you're on, he was kind of convinced to stay out of it. And I think that independent companies that formed in the 45, there were 8 to 12 companies that were forming up at that time. They convinced him not to fight. And I think he regretted that.
So they convinced some not to fight, others they drew away
Right.
from the main conflict.
Yeah. And there's a lot of stories. I think if you want a part 2
I would love a part 2.
From 1725 to 1746, it's just super fascinating. You have, for example, Simon Lovett of Fraser.
Right, which we've done some content on him, and he was all over the
What
place.
a fox. He played both sides, essentially.
Yes.
But
So the Frasers of Lovett take a side in 1715 that's different than what they do in 45 because of him.
Right.
Well, and I think that he was directly involved with these, because didn't he had an independent Highland Company, and the government suspected him and withdrew command of his own men, and it was such an assault on his pride that he was like, no, I'm not fighting for you
This is a good story. And a lot of it's because we have more documentation, right? We're talking 17th century, it's kind of sparse. But you get into the 18th century, you have these letters that they wrote themselves. But he wrote this long letter to General Wade, and that's another story that we can talk about ad nauseum. General Wade.
Who's a really interesting Englishman for Highland history.
Oh, I mean, arguably between Duncan Forbes of Culloden and General Wade, that's the modern Scotland right there. Their legacy. But he writes this long letter to General Wade, and he says, we need to rethink the Highland Companies. We need Highland Companies. I need one. And that's what starts the Black Watch. Wow. Officially, that's what starts the Black Watch. Because General Wade gets on his side, takes the letter to the Crown. The Crown says, okay, it's a great idea. Stamp it, let's get going.
Wow.
And then, he has one son fighting for the Jacobites and another son, and another kindred fighting for the government.
His son goes on to command troops the Battle of Ticonderoga? There's a famous painting.
Yeah. So it's not a son, I think it's a nephew.
Okay.
But I've been to that battlefield and I've seen Simon Fraser. Yeah.
The one from
Ticonderoga.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is a whole... Man, we need to do more of these.
Oh,
because you have Highlanders pushing into North America that are part of the regiments now. Mm-hmm. They're no longer...
Well, Bunker Hill. Didn't Bunker Hill have... I might be getting out of my depth here. but I think there was Highland troops assaulting, which they eventually took Bunker Hill, but at a pretty steep cost.
At a price they weren't expecting to pay.
At the top... Have you ever been to Bunker Hill?
I have, yeah.
You see that plaque that has that quote from the guy that says... I wish we had another hill to sell to them at such a price or something like that.
Yeah, fascinating history. But, just kind of to end things here, we go from the Highland Companies being very, the last pitch battle on British soil is Culloden. So you have them very involved in domestic disputes just because of the political turmoil. And then from there, what I find fascinating is you have these Highland troops, Highlanders not necessarily treated well by the government, but are used to grow the empire.
As shock troops.
Like
when nobody else can take it, send these madmen in. And
and I would love to talk about 1745, the Black Watch in Flanders.
Oh.
Should we do another?
We should. I mean, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's already settled. Yeah.
Because the Black Watch, there were contention about they wanted to stay in Scotland. They were brought down to be reviewed by General Wade. They knew something was happening. They knew they were getting sent abroad. Were they worried
that a bunch of the guys were sympathizers in the ranks? Is that why they physically removed them? Or do we got to talk about it next time?
I think so. I think that was more so. I think that was. When they were returning from the continent, they were worried that they had kind of been done dirty and they were going to go back up north. So the majority of the Black Watch was in England during the Battle of Culloden. They were just, they were marshaled down there. So, but yeah, another episode.
Okay.
So many cool things to talk about.
Can't wait. Thanks, Dane. Appreciate you coming on.
Okay.
Hope you enjoyed that. Can't wait to see your comments and some of the things we talked about there. If you want to reach out, it's thescottishclans@gmail.com. Marshall Lev and Rasta.